The day my kayak disappeared was the day the HOA messed with the wrong guy. I'd just come home from a long shift. My name's Logan Fairbanks, and I'm a marine engineer who knows a thing or two about water rights. My property sits right at the edge of a quiet cove, tucked away from the rest of the neighborhood. The house came with the dock, and the dock came with the deed. I double-checked all that before buying. So imagine my surprise when I stepped out back and saw my dock empty, my kayak gone, the rope still hanging there like someone had just snatched it. I stormed up to the HOA clubhouse the next morning, and that's when I met her. Zelda Zimmerman, HOA president for the past 4 years and apparently self-appointed queen of the lake. She had the haircut, the oversized sunglasses, and the smugness of someone who thought she could walk on water. "Oh, Logan," she said, drawing out my name like it was her job to ruin my week. "Your kayak was in violation of the community waterway regulations." "My kayak was on my dock, which is on my property," I said, keeping my voice steady. She smiled like she knew something I didn't. "Actually, the Cove is common property. Page 32, subsection D of the HOA handbook. You need permission to store personal watercraft on shared water." I stared at her for a second. "You're telling me you sent someone onto my dock and took my kayak?" "HOA security removed it," she said, like that made it any better. "It's being held at the clubhouse until you pay the fine and sign the proper usage agreement." "Fine. For using my own dock," Zelda crossed her arms. $175 plus storage fees. I didn't say another word, just turned around and walked out. What Zelda didn't know, and what I was about to make very clear, is that I don't just own the dock. I own the entire cove. When I bought the house 2 years ago, the previous owner had transferred the riparian rights. That meant I owned the land under the water, not just the shoreline. It's rare, but it happens. It's in the deed filed with the county, and I had the paperwork to prove it. I spent that afternoon making copies of every legal document I had: deeds, plat maps, the title insurance. I even pulled up the original subdivision plans showing the cove was privately owned before the HOA was ever formed. Then I called a buddy of mine, Valerio, a real estate attorney I fish with on weekends, and asked if he was free for a little meeting. The next morning, I walked into the HOA clubhouse with a manila folder in one hand and Valerio in the other. Zelda was mid-conversation with 2 board members when she saw us. Her smile flickered. "Well, Logan," she said. "Back to sign the agreement." I dropped the folder on the table. "Nope. I'm here to let you know you trespassed and illegally seized private property." One of the board members, a guy named Chuck, leaned forward. "Now hold on," Valerio cut him off. "We have the deed, the riparian rights, and county documentation. This cove is not common property. It is privately owned by my client." Zelda's lips tightened like she'd just bitten into a lemon. "You had no right to touch that kayak," I said. "And unless you want to explain to a judge why your security staff was climbing onto private docks, I suggest you return it." "Today." Zelda didn't speak for a long minute. Then she turned to Chuck and hissed under her breath, "Get it out of the storage room." I wasn't done. "And by the way," I added, "every boat, paddleboard, and floating flamingo you've approved for other residents in that cove, they're trespassing." "But I'm not a jerk yet." Zelda's face went pale. I gave her a polite nod. "You picked the wrong dock, Zelda." She had no idea how much worse it was about to get. Zelda didn't show up to the next HOA board meeting. I wasn't surprised. Word had already spread through the neighborhood that she'd been caught strong-arming residents over property she didn't control. Apparently, someone on the board had tried to quietly remove the incident from the meeting agenda, but a neighbor Alois from 3 doors down wasn't having it. She stood during the open comment period and asked loudly, "So who else's property are you planning to confiscate this year?" That got people talking. And when people talk, things unravel. I hadn't planned to attend that meeting, but after a dozen neighbors showed up at my door asking if the rumors were true that I actually owned the cove, I figured it was time to bring a few things into the light. I arrived with a folded easel map under my arm and a heavy binder marked Property Records Fairbanks. Chuck, the vice president of the board, looked like he'd swallowed a mouthful of gravel when he saw me walk in. He tried to keep things moving along, rushing through the landscaping budget like anyone cared about mulch when the HOA had just illegally seized private property. When I raised my hand, 3 others immediately went up with mine. Chuck hesitated, then nodded at me. "I think the community deserves to know what happened last week," I said, laying the map across the table. "This is the original plat map of the neighborhood registered with the county. This cove, every inch of water and land beneath it is privately held, not by the HOA, not by the community." "By me?" Someone in the back let out a low whistle. A few phones came out. Chuck cleared his throat. "We've been operating under the assumption the cove was common property. That's what our records show." "Then your records are wrong," I said, "and I have the deed and title history to prove it. Your president authorized personnel to enter private property and remove personal belongings without cause, warrant, or authority. And let me be clear, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate." Chuck tried to pivot. "Let's not turn this into a witch hunt. Zelda's not here to, of course she's not, because she knew this would come up, but this isn't just about my kayak. I've been doing some digging." I pulled out a second folder. "Seems the HOA has been collecting dues for so-called water maintenance and shoreline access for years." "That's illegal. You can't collect fees for property you don't own." That got everyone's attention. A man in a pressed golf shirt near the front raised his hand. "Are you saying the HOA charged us for upkeep on something they have no legal rights to?" "Yes," I said plainly, "and it gets worse. Those same funds were used to pay for security patrols around the cove. According to their own records, those patrols entered docks and watercraft not just on mine but other properties too. That's trespassing." A woman near the side stood. "They came onto my dock last summer and told my son he couldn't fish there, said it was restricted water. He was 9. That opened the floodgates. One after another, residents shared stories: a paddleboard confiscated, a warning letter for tying a float to a post, a threat of fines for installing a bench on a privately owned deck that faced the cove. It became clear this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. And then Eloise dropped the bomb. "My nephew works in county records," she said calmly. "I asked him to pull every property deed adjacent to the cove. Turns out, Logan's right. Not only is the cove private, but the HOA filed a bogus easement claim 2 years ago. They tried to declare the waterway as community managed without notifying the actual owner. That's document fraud." Dead silence. Chuck's hands twitched. "That has to be a mistake." "Nope," Eloise said, holding up a printout. "Filed under Zelda Zimmerman's name. She signed it as both president and designated property trustee. That's not a title, it's made up." I turned to the crowd. "This isn't just about improper fines. This is felony-level stuff. Fraud, trespassing, abuse of authority, and I've already spoken with the sheriff's office." That's when Chuck panicked. "You involved law enforcement." "I had to. You entered my property, removed my belongings, and attempted to enforce control over land you don't own. That's theft. I filed a report. The deputy I spoke with confirmed the HOA has no jurisdiction over privately deeded water. An investigation is underway." Someone clapped, then a second person. Then the whole room. Chuck tried to restore order, banging a makeshift gavel against the table. "Let's maintain decorum." But he was drowned out by the voices around him. People weren't angry, they were livid. They wanted to know how much of their dues had been wasted. Who had authorized the security patrols? Whether other areas of the neighborhood had been misrepresented? I leaned toward Chuck. "You might want to lawyer up. Zelda too. Because I'm not the only person pressing charges." By the time the meeting ended, a motion had been raised to suspend the entire board until a third-party audit could be conducted. It passed with overwhelming support. An emergency vote was scheduled for the following week. No one fought it. As I walked out, a man I didn't recognize caught up to me near the door. He was older, wore a faded navy ball cap with a Coast Guard insignia. "You Fairbanks?" he asked. I nodded. He extended a calloused hand. "Name's Hank. Used to be on the board back when this place was decent." I resigned when Zelda started pulling fast ones. I warned them not to mess with property lines. They didn't listen. "I appreciate that," I said. Hank thumbed toward the Cove. "That water's been private since the Carter administration. You were right to stand your ground." "Most folks just roll over." "I don't roll," I said simply. He grinned. "I can see that. If you ever want help drafting new bylaws, let me know. Place could use someone who actually reads what they sign." Later that night, I got a call from Deputy Calderon, the officer handling my report. He'd spoken with the HOA's private security company, who confirmed they'd been ordered to remove unauthorized watercraft from the Cove. No legal review, no verification of ownership, just a verbal directive from Zelda. "You're looking at a strong civil case," Calderon said. "And possibly more, depending on what we find in her emails." I thanked him and hung up. The next morning, a tow truck arrived at the clubhouse and removed a small trailer marked HOA Security. No one knew who called it, but I had a hunch. Zelda's nameplate was missing from the board sign by noon. Her house went dark that afternoon. Rumor was she'd packed up and left town. The neighborhood was quiet that evening, peaceful. I sat at the end of my dock, watching the sunset ripple across water that was mine, fair and square. And for the first time in months, I let myself smile. 3 days after Zelda's mysterious disappearance, I received a certified letter from the HOA's interim legal representative. It was thinly veiled damage control language about unintentional overreach, temporary reassessment of enforcement mechanisms, and a tepid request for a constructive dialogue. No apology, no restitution, just an attempt to feel out how much trouble they were actually in. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the letter to Valerio and then drove down to the county recorder's office with Alois. She'd offered to help sort through archived HOA filings, and I wasn't about to turn down someone with her level of quiet tenacity. We weren't looking for mistakes anymore, we were looking for patterns. It didn't take long. Over the past 3 years, the HOA had filed a series of easement declarations, each written in vague, bloated legalese claiming vague administrative authority over various parcels of land. Not ownership. Just utility access and aesthetic oversight. But someone with even a basic understanding of land law would know. You can't declare an easement on property you don't own or have written permission to access. We found 6. One of them was for a stretch of shoreline behind the Parkers' old place. They'd moved out last year after a drawn-out battle over a retaining wall that the HOA had ordered them to tear down. At the time, most people thought it was over landscaping. Turns out, their wall was technically on their own land, and the HOA had cited a fabricated easement to demand its removal. Alois looked up from the file. "They bullied them out," I nodded, "and probably sold the lot for a premium once the wall was gone. We took photos of every document, logged dates, and matched them against outgoing HOA expenditures. That's when we uncovered something we hadn't expected. Under a miscellaneous entry labeled Community Enhancement Fund, there were several payments made directly to a private contracting company called Blue Ridge Siteworks. Valerio ran a business registry search. Blue Ridge didn't have a website, no tax ID on file, and the only contact listed was a burner phone registered to a shell company in Nevada. Classic laundering behavior. By the end of the week, Valerio had enough to draft a formal complaint to the state attorney general's office. He also filed a motion in civil court requesting a temporary injunction to freeze the HOA's discretionary spending accounts pending investigation. The court granted it. That same afternoon, Chuck showed up at my door. He wasn't wearing the usual HOA badge or clipboard, just a windbreaker and a face that looked like it hadn't slept in 2 days. "I didn't know they were doing all this," he said, eyes shifting toward the Cove. "I thought I was just helping with annual reports and vendor approvals." I didn't sign off on any of those land claims. Then you'll want to make that clear to the Attorney General's office, I said. Soon, he hesitated. I've got emails Zelda's. She forwarded me drafts for those easement filings. Said they were routine maintenance protocols. I didn't look too closely. I figured the lawyers had vetted them. Did the board vote on any of it? No, she said it was part of executive authority. I didn't push back. Then you're complicit. Whether you meant to be or not. Chuck looked like he'd been hit by a wave. I've got a daughter starting college next fall. If I lose my job over this, no one's coming after your job, I said. But if you want to avoid being subpoenaed as a hostile witness, you need to start cooperating. Fully, he nodded, then handed me a USB drive. Every email I ever got from her, it's all there. She used her HOA account for everything. That night, Valerio went through the drive. It was worse than we expected. Not only had Zelda orchestrated the fake easements, but she'd also coordinated with someone inside the title office, a temp employee named Miles, who had quietly altered digital parcel maps during late-night shifts. The changes had been subtle, almost invisible to the casual eye. But legally, they were meaningless. County records still held the originals, using forged maps to justify property control. Now we were looking at criminal conspiracy. Valerio made a second call to the sheriff's office. This time, they didn't just take notes. They opened a formal investigation and secured a warrant for Zelda's HOA email account and all related financial records. Within 48 hours, deputies had seized 3 boxes of documents from the HOA clubhouse. Chuck, likely trying to save his own skin, voluntarily submitted a statement. So did 2 other board members. Both claimed they'd been manipulated or excluded from key decisions. One of them mentioned that Zelda had once bragged during a private dinner that most residents don't even know where their lot lines end. She'd laughed and added, "That's what makes them manageable." Meanwhile, a quiet revolution was building in the neighborhood. Residents who had once kept to themselves were now sharing property records, comparing boundary lines and drafting petitions. Hank, the former board member, organized a community forum at the local library. Over 60 people showed up. Not one current board member attended. During the forum, someone asked if we could dismantle the HOA entirely. An older woman in the back, Margaret, a retired municipal clerk, raised her hand. Actually, yes. If 2/3 of property owners sign a dissolution petition and file it with the state registrar, the corporation can be dissolved. But it has to be airtight. No technical errors, Aloy stood. Then let's get started. Over the next week, signature sheets circulated like wildfire. Garage doors opened. Front porches turned into legal workstations. One neighbor, a former notary, offered free certification services all weekend. Another designed a map showing exactly which parcels had signed and which hadn't. By the end of the 3rd day, we were at 61%. Then came the twist. Deputy Calderon called Valerio with an update. Zelda had been located living under her maiden name in a rental unit 2 counties over. She drained the HOA emergency fund account and wired most of it to a private account in Belize. They were working with federal agents now. The charges were stacking: wire fraud, false filings, unlawful seizure of property, and conspiracy to defraud a homeowners association. I drove to the next emergency meeting not to observe but to deliver a motion. As interim chair, Chuck called the group to order, visibly nervous. "Mr. Fairbanks has requested the floor." I stood, holding the dissolution petition. "With 2/3 of property owners' signatures collected, I hereby motion for the immediate dissolution of the Harbor Glen Homeowners Association, effective upon state filing." Murmurs. Then applause. Chuck looked around. "Is there a second?" Alois raised her hand. Seconded, all in favor, a sea of hands. All opposed, silence. Chuck swallowed. Motion carried. No one cheered this time. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quiet, final. The kind of silence that follows a long, hard storm. Later, I walked back to my dock. I sat down, the kayak floating lazily beside me, tied exactly where it belonged. The water was still. Untouched, behind me the neighborhood had changed, but beneath me, that cove was mine. And now, everyone knew it. The papers went through faster than anyone expected. The state registrar filed the HOA's dissolution documents just 2 weeks after the vote. No protests, no appeals, just a quiet termination of a once feared institution. The Harbor Glen Homeowners Association ceased to exist as a legal entity at 10:43 a.m. on a Tuesday. By noon, Chuck had cleared out the old clubhouse. He didn't say goodbye, just left the keys on a hook and drove off in a dusty sedan with a cracked taillight and a resigned expression. He'd done what little damage control he could, but even he knew his name would be tied to Zelda's circus for years. The real storm, though, was just getting started. A week after the dissolution, I received a federal subpoena. Not because I was in trouble, but because I was listed as the initial complainant and primary property holder in the affected district. Federal investigators had stepped in after tracing the siphoned funds Zelda had wired out of the HOA accounts, just over $78,000 in misappropriated dues. That kind of money, funneled through a fabricated LLC with the help of a falsified easement scheme, had elevated the case to a federal wire fraud investigation. Valerio accompanied me to the hearing. It was held in a plain government office downtown with long metal benches and a vending machine that hadn't worked in what looked like a decade. The lead investigator, a woman named Agent Kessler, didn't waste time. "Mr. Fairbanks, we've reviewed your filings. Your documentation was meticulous. We believe this isn't just a case of embezzlement. It's organized fraud under the guise of HOA authority." She opened a binder with printed screenshots of emails between Zelda and her shell companies contact a man named Raymond Lutz. He wasn't a contractor. He was a disbarred real estate broker from Arizona with 2 prior convictions for title manipulation and unlicensed surveying. Zelda had hired him to fabricate parcel overlays and draft fraudulent maintenance claims, which she then used as justification to fine residents and seize property. "This wasn't sloppy governance," Kessler said. "It was a criminal racket." They'd already issued a warrant for Lutz. He was picked up the same morning in Yuma, trying to cross the border with a trailer full of documents and a laptop wrapped in tinfoil. The man folded within hours of questioning and handed over everything: transaction records, message logs, even audio recordings of video calls with Zelda discussing how to make these people stop asking questions. Back at Harbor Glen, the fallout hit hard. Residents who'd quietly paid shoreline access fees or coughed up fines for unapproved water features found themselves eligible for restitution. A legal fund was established through a state-managed community fraud recovery program. I donated the first $5,000 myself, money I'd originally set aside to resurface my driveway. By the end of the month, over 40 households had submitted claims. Eloise took charge of organizing the new community charter. Without the HOA, the neighborhood needed a framework, just not one built on fear and fiction. We formed a volunteer council with rotating seats, no fees, and zero enforcement power. It was purely advisory. The council's only job was to coordinate block events, mediate disputes, and keep up a shared calendar for maintenance projects that actually mattered. Hank volunteered to handle property boundary disputes. No one argued. Then the trial date came. Zelda had been extradited from the cabin she'd rented under her maiden name. Despite her frantic attempts to claim she'd been misled by legal counsel, the evidence was stacked too high and too tight. The prosecution had bank transfers, falsified filings, and recordings of her giving direct orders to alter property maps. I took the stand for 27 minutes. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just walked through the facts: the missing kayak, the fake fines, the forged easements, the illegal seizure of private property. I explained how she'd tried to control an area she never had legal access to. I showed the judge the original deed, signed and notarized with the riparian rights highlighted in bold. When I stepped down, Zelda wouldn't look at me. She just gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale, like she still couldn't believe it had come apart. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on 6 counts. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, mail fraud, falsification of public records, unlawful seizure of property, criminal impersonation of a public official, and obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced her to 11 years in federal prison, with an additional 5 years of probation and a full forfeiture of all assets gained through the scheme. She'd serve her time in a federal correctional facility in Oregon, far from the lakes and docks she had once tried to rule like a tyrant in designer sunglasses. After the trial, I walked out into the sunlight with Alois and Valerio. Neither said much. We didn't need to. There was a kind of finality in the way the doors closed behind us. The neighborhood changed in subtle ways after that. The old clubhouse was converted into a community rec room. No one needed permission to use it. Kids hung wind chimes from the eaves. Someone planted wildflowers where the old HOA security sign had been staked. The air around the cove felt lighter, like a weight had lifted that no one had realized was there until it was gone. One afternoon, I was working on refinishing my dock boards when a kid from down the street wandered over, holding a fishing rod and a tackle box. "Hey, Mr. Fairbanks," he said, eyes wide. "Is it okay if I fish off the end of your dock?" I looked up. "You know this is private property, right?" He nodded quickly. "Yeah, but Chuck said you're cool about it now." I grinned and leaned back on my heels. "Only if you don't leave your hooks in my boards." He beamed and scrambled down to the edge, tossing his line with the kind of exaggerated flourish only a 10-year-old could get away with. Later that week, I got a letter from the state's fraud restitution office. Turns out, Zelda had been forced to liquidate several assets, including a lakeside home in Vermont and a vintage convertible she'd kept in storage under a fake name. I was being issued a compensation check for the full amount of the fine she'd tried to impose on me, plus damages for unlawful interference with my property. I deposited it the same day and ordered a new kayak, not because I needed it, just because I could. By the time summer rolled in, the Cove had become more than just a property line. It was a gathering place. Kids swam at the inlet, neighbors held floating potlucks, and someone even strung up a hammock between 2 old posts near the water's edge. No one asked for permission. No one issued warnings or citations. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridge and the water turned a deep amber, Valerio joined me on the dock with 2 bottles of beer and a quiet nod. "You realize," he said, "you didn't just win this for yourself." I didn't say anything. "Just listen to the water lapping against the posts. You made it safe for people to stand up again," he said. "That counts for something." I watched the kayak drift gently with the current, tethered loosely beside the dock. It bobbed in rhythm with the breeze, steady, balanced, free. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was guarding something. I felt like I was sharing it, on my own terms.